The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Passengers hurriedly dragging suitcases, announcements echoing through the terminal, and the faint aroma of coffee blending with the tension of looming departure times. Among the sea of travelers stood a man who exuded an air of calm, seemingly untouched by the frantic energy around him. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that turned a few heads. His name was Marcus Steele, a figure that many might overlook in the crowd, but one who carried a story no one could have imagined. Marcus wasn't just another passenger. While he blended seamlessly into the everyday hustle of the terminal, his position in the world was anything but ordinary. Marcus was the owner of the very airline whose logo adorned the check-in counters and planes lined up outside. However, he didn't flaunt his power or wealth. For Marcus, this trip wasn't about status. It was about reconnecting with the people, employees, and the customers who made his airline thrive. As Marcus approached the gate, holding a sleek black leather briefcase and a ticket to board one of his planes, he noticed a commotion ahead. A sharp voice cut through the air, a flight attendant's tone tinged with irritation. She stood at the boarding gate, her uniform perfectly pressed, her demeanor polished, but her words carried an edge that wasn't easily missed. "Sir, I've already explained this to you," the flight attendant said, her voice cold and dismissive. "You need to step aside." Marcus paused, observing the interaction. Passenger, an older man with a worn baseball cap and a gentle demeanor, looked flustered as he tried to explain his situation. The attendant's impatience grew, and Marcus felt a pang of unease. This wasn't the image he wanted his airline to represent, ever. But before he could step forward, the line moved, and it was his turn to hand over his ticket. The flight attendant barely glanced at him as she extended her hand. "Ticket, please." Marcus handed her his boarding pass with a polite smile. The smile wasn't returned. She scanned the ticket and then paused, frowning. Her gaze shifted from the ticket to Marcus, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "This seat is taken," she said flatly. Marcus's brow furrowed. "I believe there's been a mistake. That's my seat," he replied, his tone calm but firm. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked at him with a mix of skepticism and annoyance. "I'm going to need you to step aside. We'll handle this, but you can't board this plane right now." "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. The flight attendant huffed, her patience clearly running thin. "The problem is that this ticket doesn't look valid. And frankly, sir, you're holding up the line." For a moment, Marcus thought about clarifying who he was. He could easily pull out his phone, call the airline's CEO, his own employee, and settle this in seconds. But something stopped him. There was a principle at play here, something deeper than convenience or ego. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked, giving her one last chance to reconsider. Her response was swift and unapologetic. In one quick motion, she tore the ticket in half, the sound of ripping paper slicing through the tension in the air. "I'm sure," she said, her tone final. "You're not flying today." The terminal seemed to freeze for a moment. Passengers nearby turned their heads, some whispering to each other, their curiosity piqued by the escalating situation. Marcus stood still, holding the remnants of his ticket, his mind racing not with anger, but with disappointment. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about how people in power treated others where they thought no one was watching. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" Marcus asked, his voice even, though there was an unmistakable edge to it now. The flight attendant rolled her eyes. "You can file a complaint later. Right now, I have a job to do." She turned her attention to the next passenger, dismissing Marcus as if he were invisible. Marcus stepped aside, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing within him. He wasn't angry for himself. He'd dealt with far worse in his life. But the blatant disregard for respect, the dismissal of someone without even understanding their story, that struck a nerve. He pulled out his phone, not to call for backup, but to take notes. This wasn't the first time he'd heard about incidents like this happening at his airline, but witnessing it firsthand added a weight that no report or email could convey. As he typed, A woman approached him cautiously. She had been standing a few people back in line, her phone still in hand from recording part of the incident. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, that was wrong. The way she treated you. I got it on video if you need it." Marcus looked at her, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," he said, offering a small smile. "I appreciate that." The woman nodded and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He glanced back at the gate where the flight attendant continued her work, oblivious to the ripple effect her actions had already set in motion. Marcus wasn't a man who sought revenge, but he believed in accountability, in holding people and systems to the standards they claimed to uphold. As he walked away from the gate, Marcus knew this moment was just the beginning. He didn't need to announce who he was or demand immediate retribution. The truth would come out soon enough, and when it did, it wouldn't just be about a torn ticket. It would be about change, real, lasting change. And for Marcus Steele, that change couldn't come soon enough. Marcus walked away from the gate, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor of the terminal. In his hand were the torn pieces of his ticket, now a symbol of something far bigger than an unfortunate misunderstanding. He slipped the fragments into his pocket, his mind replaying the events, the flight attendant's dismissive tone, the look in her eyes as she dismissed him, and the quiet murmurs of onlookers who had witnessed it all. He wasn't angry. Marcus had learned long ago that anger rarely solved anything. But he couldn't ignore the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him and assumed they understood who he was or who he wasn't, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time was different. Marcus owned this airline. He continued walking, his pace slow as he passed rows of bustling travelers. On the surface, he was just another man in a tailored suit, blending into the crowd. But inside, his thoughts churned. He didn't want to act out of pride or a need to prove himself. He wanted to act because what he had just experienced wasn't right. And if it wasn't right for him, it wasn't right for any of his passengers. Marcus made his way to a quieter part of the terminal, away from the noise and the crowds. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Dana Campbell, the airline's chief operating officer. Dana was someone Marcus trusted deeply, not just for her sharp business acumen, but for her unshakable integrity. She was one of the few people in the company who truly understood his vision for the airline, a vision that prioritized people over profits. He hesitated for a moment before pressing the call button. This wasn't a conversation he wanted to have over the phone, but time was of the essence. "Marcus," Dana answered after the first ring, her voice warm but businesslike. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I just had an experience at the airport that we need to talk about. It's concerning." Dana's tone shifted immediately, a note of worry creeping in. "What happened?" "I'll explain everything when I see you, but I need you to meet me at the executive lounge. Can you get here in the next 20 minutes? "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "I'll be there." As Marcus ended the call, he glanced back toward the gate he had left behind. The flight attendant was still there, her sharp, dismissive demeanor unchanged. He wondered how many other passengers had been on the receiving end of her attitude, how many people had walked away feeling humiliated or less than. He shook his head and made his way to the lounge. The executive lounge was a stark contrast to the bustling terminal outside. The space was quiet, almost serene, with plush seating and large windows that offered a panoramic view of the runway. Marcus chose a seat near the window and sat down, his thoughts still racing. A few minutes later, Dana walked in, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She was a petite woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority that belied her size. She spotted Marcus immediately and made her way over. "Marcus," she said, as she sat down across from him. "You look unsettled. That's not like you." He gave her a small smile. "I've had an interesting morning." "Tell me," she said, leaning forward. Marcus recounted the incident in detail, his tone measured but firm. He described the flight attendant's demeanor, the way she had dismissed him, and the moment she had ripped up his ticket without even trying to resolve the situation. Dana listened intently, her expression growing more serious with every word. When he finished, she sat back in her chair, her brow furrowed. "That's unacceptable," she said. "Completely unacceptable. I'll launch an investigation immediately." Marcus shook his head. "This isn't just about one flight attendant, Dana. This is about the culture we're fostering, or failing to foster. If she feels comfortable treating passengers like this, what does that say about the training we're providing, about the standards we're setting?" Dana nodded slowly, her mind clearly working through the implications. "You're right," she said. "This isn't just about her, it's about us." "I don't want her fired," Marcus said quickly. "At least, not yet. People don't learn from being cast aside. They learn from being held accountable. But I do want to understand how this happened, and how we can make sure it doesn't happen again." Dana leaned forward again, her eyes sharp. "We'll start by reviewing her file and speaking to her directly. But I think this goes deeper than one employee. We need to take a hard look at our training programs, our hiring practices, even the way we handle customer service complaints. If this is happening here, it's probably happening elsewhere too." Marcus nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. Dana was exactly the kind of leader he needed in moments like this. Someone who would take a problem and turn it into an opportunity for growth. "Let's do it," he said, "and let's not wait. I want this addressed immediately." Dana stood, her expression determined. "Consider it done." As she left, Marcus turned back to the window, watching as a plane taxied down the runway. He thought about the passengers on board, the people who had trusted his airline to get them where they needed to go. They deserved better than what he had witnessed today. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. It was a text from an unknown number. He saw what happened at the gate. That wasn't right. "If you need someone to back you up, I'm here." Marcus stared at the message, a mix of emotions swirling within him. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It was a reminder that people were watching, that they cared. He typed a quick reply. "Thank you. Your support means more than you know." As he put his phone away, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing a single incident. This was about creating a ripple effect, about challenging a culture that allowed moments like this to happen in the first place. And he wasn't going to stop until he saw real, lasting change. Marcus spent the rest of the day at the airport, moving quietly but purposefully. The tension from earlier lingered, a weight in the air he couldn't quite shake. He wanted to see for himself how his airline operated, not from the comfort of the boardroom, but from the heart of it, where the passengers and employees interacted daily. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed things he might not have before. A young family struggling to navigate the check-in kiosks while an indifferent agent looked on. A traveler at the customer service desk, growing increasingly frustrated as her questions went unanswered. And then there were the employees, some rushing to help, others moving with a kind of robotic detachment, as if the weight of their jobs had long since drained any enthusiasm they might have had. It was clear to Marcus that the issue ran deeper than one employee's behavior. There was a disconnect somewhere, a breakdown in the values he had worked so hard to instill in his company. And the more he saw, the more determined he became to fix it. Meanwhile, Dana had wasted no time launching her investigation. She had already pulled the flight attendant's personnel file and discovered that this wasn't her first complaint. There were notes about her being short-tempered and dismissive, but the complaints had never escalated beyond a warning. Dana wondered how many of these warnings had gone unheeded and what it said about the system they had in place. She also began to dig into the broader culture of the airline, speaking with employees at every level. What she found was a mixed bag. Some employees spoke passionately about their jobs, about how much they loved helping people and being part of something bigger than themselves. But others painted a very different picture: understaffing, unrealistic expectations, and a lack of accountability for bad behavior. Dana brought her findings to Marcus that evening. They met in a quiet corner of the airport, away from prying eyes. She laid it all out, the flight attendant's history, the systemic issues she had uncovered, and the steps she believed they needed to take to address it all. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. "This isn't just a training issue," he said finally. "It's a leadership issue. If our managers aren't holding people accountable, then nothing we do at the top is going to make a difference." Dana nodded, agreed, but changing that is going to take time. In the short term, we need to address what happened today. The passengers who witnessed it, the flight attendant herself, they all need to know that we take this seriously. "I'll talk to her," Marcus said. Dana looked surprised. "You want to talk to her directly?" "Yes," he replied firmly. "If we're going to create a culture of accountability, it has to start with me. I need her to understand not just what she did wrong, but why it matters." The next day, Marcus arranged a meeting with the flight attendant, whose name he now knew was Karen. She walked into the room with a defensive air, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had been told she was meeting with a senior executive, but she clearly hadn't connected the dots about who Marcus really was. "Have a seat," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. Karen sat down, her expression guarded. "Look, if this is about the guy from yesterday, I already told my supervisor what happened. He didn't have the right ticket. I was just following protocol." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand that's how you saw it, but I'd like to hear more about why you handled it the way you did." Karen frowned, clearly caught off guard. "I don't know. He was being difficult, and I had other passengers to deal with. I didn't have time to argue with him." "Do you remember his name?" Marcus asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. You remember what he looked like?" Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. He was tall, black, wearing a suit. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "And based on that, you decided he didn't belong in first class." Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Karen. I'm here to understand. Because the way you treated that passenger wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, something that speaks to how we, as an airline, treat the people who trust us to take care of them." Karen looked down at her hands, her defensive posture softening. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she said quietly. "I was just trying to do my job." "I believe you," Marcus said. "But part of your job is making sure every passenger feels valued, no matter what they look like or where they're sitting. And yesterday, you failed to do that." There was a long silence as Karen absorbed his words. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and defiance. "Who are you anyway?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I'm the passenger whose ticket you ripped up, and also the owner of this airline." Karen's face went pale, and she sank back in her chair. "I didn't know." "That's the point," Marcus said. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The room fell silent again, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. For the first time, Karen seemed to truly grasp the gravity of what had happened. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate that," Marcus replied. "But an apology isn't enough. If you want to continue working here, you're going to need to show that you're willing to change, not just for me, but for every passenger you interact with." Karen nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'll do better," she said. Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, hope. This was just one conversation, one step in what he knew would be a long journey. But it was a start. As he left the room, he glanced back at Karen, who sat alone, staring down at her hands. He hoped she meant what she said, because the culture of his airline depended not just on policies and training, but on people like Karen, who had the power to make or break a passenger's experience with a single interaction. Marcus walked away, his mind already turning to the next steps. There was still so much work to be done, so many questions to answer. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let this moment pass without making it count. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Marcus. He dove headfirst into addressing the deeper issues within his airline, holding meetings with every department, speaking directly with both employees and passengers, and observing interactions across different airports. What he uncovered was both disheartening and motivating. The problem wasn't limited to one rude employee or one bad day. It was a culture that had grown complacent, a system where passengers felt like numbers and employees felt undervalued. At the same time, word of the incident with Karen had begun to spread. It started with whispers among the staff and quickly became a full-blown rumor. Some employees speculated about Marcus' intentions, wondering if he was planning a major shake-up. Others dismissed the story entirely, convinced it was an exaggeration. But as the buzz grew louder, so did the tension within the company. Employees who had grown comfortable with the status quo began to worry, while those who had been frustrated by the lack of accountability saw a glimmer of hope. For Marcus, the challenge was walking the fine line between enforcing change and building trust. He didn't want his employees to see him as an authoritarian figure swooping into clean house. He wanted them to understand that his goal was to create an airline they could all be proud of, one that valued its customers and its staff equally. But as the days wore on, he realized just how deep the cracks in the foundation went. Dana, ever the sharp investigator, was by his side through it all. She became his sounding board, his strategist, and sometimes even his voice of reason when his frustration threatened to get the better of him. One evening, as they reviewed the latest round of feedback from passengers, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "Marcus, you know this isn't going to be a quick fix," she said. "You're trying to change the mindset of an entire company. That's not something you can do overnight." "I know," Marcus replied, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't just sit back and let things stay the way they are. Every day we wait, more passengers are having experiences like the one I had, and that's unacceptable." Dana nodded, her expression softening. "You're right, but you also need to pace yourself. If you push too hard, too fast, you risk losing the people you need to make this work." Marcus let her words sink in. She was right, of course. Change was a marathon, not a sprint. But the urgency he felt was hard to ignore. He couldn't shake the image of Karen ripping up his ticket, the casual indifference in her voice as she dismissed him. And he couldn't help but wonder how many other passengers had been treated the same way. Passengers who didn't have the power to call a meeting with the CEO or demand answers. The turning point came during a meeting with the senior leadership team. Marcus had spent hours preparing his presentation, outlining a new vision for the airline that emphasized empathy, accountability, and excellence. But as he looked around the room, he could see the skepticism in their eyes. One executive, a veteran of the industry, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Marcus, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but this is the airline business. People don't expect perfection. They just want to get from point A to point B. As long as the planes are on time and the fares are reasonable, they're not going to care about a few bad apples." Marcus felt his frustration flare, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I disagree," he said evenly. "Our passengers do care. They care about how they're treated, about whether we see them as individuals or just ticket numbers. And if we don't care, we're giving them every reason to choose another airline the next time they fly." Another executive chimed in, her tone cautious. "But Marcus, changing the culture isn't just about setting new standards. It's about getting buy-in from the people on the front lines. And right now, a lot of them feel overworked and underappreciated. If we start coming down hard on them without addressing those issues, we're going to see a lot of pushback." "That's exactly why we need to do this," Marcus countered. "Because the way we've been operating isn't sustainable. If our employees are burned out, it's because we haven't given them the tools and support they need to succeed. And if they're taking that frustration out on passengers, it's because we haven't held them accountable for the way they represent this company." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the group. Marcus could see the resistance in their faces, but he could also see a flicker of something else, curiosity, maybe even hope. It was Dana who broke the silence. "Look, I know this feels like a big ask," she said, her tone measured. "But the truth is, we can't afford not to do this. The airline industry is changing, and passengers have more options than ever. If we want to stay competitive, we have to be better, not just at flying planes, but at treating people the way they deserve to be treated. Slowly, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The skepticism didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, replaced by a tentative willingness to listen. Marcus knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was gaining ground. As the meeting ended and the executives filed out, Dana turned to Marcus with a small smile. "You're getting through to them," she said. "Maybe," Marcus replied. "But the hard part's still ahead." And he was right. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging of his career. He implemented new training programs, revamped the company's customer service policies, and held town hall meetings with employees to hear their concerns. The changes were met with a mix of enthusiasm and resistance, and there were moments when Marcus wondered if he was fighting a losing battle. But then, slowly things began to shift. Passengers started sharing positive stories about their experiences with the airline. Stories of employees going above and beyond to help, of flights where every detail seemed to be handled with care. And within the company, Marcus noticed a change in the way employees interacted with each other. There was still work to be done, but the seeds of a new culture were starting to take root. But not everyone was on board with the changes. Karen, in particular, seemed to struggle with the new expectations. She attended the training sessions and said all the right things, but Marcus could sense her resentment simmering beneath the surface. And he couldn't shake the feeling that her resistance was building towards something he couldn't yet see but knew was coming. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Marcus received a call from Dana. There had been an incident involving Karen, and this time, the stakes were even higher. As Marcus raced to the airport to deal with the fallout, his mind raced with questions. What had happened? Was it too late to turn things around? And most importantly, could he prove to everyone, his employees, his passengers, and himself, that change was truly possible? The answer, he knew, would determine the future of his airline, and of everything he had worked so hard to build. Marcus's car sped through the evening traffic, the city lights blurring past him as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. Dana's voice over the phone had been steady but tinged with urgency, and the details of the situation replayed in his mind. Karen had been involved in yet another confrontation, but this time it wasn't with a passenger. It was with a fellow employee, one of the newer recruits who had been outspoken about wanting change within the company. The incident had escalated quickly, with raised voices in the employee lounge and a gathering crowd of onlookers. According to Dana, Karen had accused the younger employee of undermining her authority and had lashed out in a way that shocked everyone. It wasn't just the argument that was troubling. It was the language Karen had used, a tone so dismissive and condescending that it left others stunned into silence. As Marcus parked and made his way to the airport, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the message her actions sent to the rest of the team, the culture he was trying so hard to change, and the fragile progress they'd made. He knew he couldn't afford to mishandle this moment. When he arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Employees stood in small clusters, their hushed conversations stopping as Marcus walked past. Dana was waiting for him near the lounge, her expression serious. "It's worse than I thought," she said quietly. "Karen didn't just argue with the employee, she implied that the changes we're making are pointless. She said something about how things have always been this way, and nothing Marcus does will change that." Marcus felt a flicker of anger, but quickly tamped it down. He couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. "Where is she now?" he asked. "In the office," Dana replied. "But before you talk to her, you should know something else. The employee she argued with, she was recording the conversation on her phone. It's already making its way around the staff." The news hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. A recording meant the incident wasn't just a private matter anymore. It was ammunition, something that could be used to further divide the team or undermine the changes he was working so hard to implement. As he entered the office, Marcus found Karen sitting stiffly in a chair, her arms crossed defensively. Her face was a mask of defiance, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Perhaps fear, or the realization that this time she might have gone too far. "Karen," Marcus began, keeping his tone calm but firm, "we need to talk about what happened." "I'm sure you've already made up your mind," Karen shot back. "Everyone here is so quick to judge, but no one wants to talk about how hard it is to deal with these so-called changes you're pushing on us." Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I understand that change can be difficult, but what happened today goes beyond resistance to change. It's about respect, both for your colleagues and for the values this company stands for." Karen's expression hardened. "Respect? Don't talk to me about respect, Marcus. You come in here with all these ideas, acting like you know better than the people who've been here for years. Do you have any idea how hard we've worked to keep this airline running?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I do, and that's why I'm trying to make it better for everyone. But that starts with accountability. We can't build a better company if we're tearing each other down in the process." Karen's silence spoke volumes, but before Marcus could say more, Dana knocked lightly on the door and stepped in. Her expression was grave. "Marcus, there's something else you need to see." Dana handed him a tablet, and Marcus's heart sank as he watched the video of the argument. Karen's words were cutting, dismissive, and worse, laced with a subtle but unmistakable condescension that made the younger employee's discomfort all too clear. The recording ended with Karen storming out of the lounge, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. "This is already spreading among the staff," Dana said quietly, "and I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up on social media. We need to address this quickly." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. The situation was spiraling faster than he'd anticipated, and the stakes were higher than ever. He knew he needed to act decisively, not just to address Karen's behavior, but to send a clear message to the entire company. But even as he prepared to take action, another thought lingered in the back of his mind. What if Karen wasn't the only one who felt this way? What if there were others, quietly resisting the changes, waiting for the right moment to push back? The next day, Marcus called an emergency meeting with the leadership team. He played the video for them, watching their reactions closely. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable, and a few, like the veteran executive who had questioned Marcus's vision, seemed almost resigned. "This is what we're up against," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "If we don't address this now, we risk losing everything we've been working toward. But this isn't just about Karen. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he was asking too much, pushing too hard. But then one of the younger executives spoke up. "I think you're right," she said. "This isn't just about Karen. It's about all of us. We've let things slide for too long, and now we're paying the price. But if we're going to fix this, we need to be all in." Her words seemed to break the tension in the room, and slowly the others began to nod in agreement. For the first time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't in this fight alone. As the meeting ended and the team dispersed, Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind already racing with plans for the next steps. The video had been a wake-up call, not just for him, but for the entire company. And though the challenges ahead were daunting, he was determined to face them head-on. But even as he prepared for the next phase of the battle, a new question began to take shape in his mind. What if the real challenge wasn't just about changing the culture of the airline? What if it was about uncovering the deeper truths, truths that had been buried for years, hidden beneath the surface of the company he thought he knew so well? The answer, he realized, might be closer than he thought, and it might change everything. Marcus stood at the front of the packed conference room, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. Every seat was filled, with the rest of the staff standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The employees murmured amongst themselves, exchanging glances filled with curiosity and unease. The events of the past few days had shaken everyone, and now they were all here, waiting for answers, accountability, or perhaps even closure. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium, as his eyes scanned the room. Dana stood near the back, giving him a small, reassuring nod. Karen was there too, her face unreadable, seated near the front with her arms crossed tightly. The younger employee she had clashed with sat a few seats away, looking down at her lap. "I called this meeting," Marcus began, his voice clear and steady, "because something happened recently that cannot be ignored. Something that goes against everything we're trying to build here." The room fell silent, the murmurs fading as everyone's attention locked on him. He glanced briefly at the screen behind him, where the now infamous recording was frozen on the final frame. He had debated whether or not to show it again, but ultimately decided against it. The staff had already seen it, and the last thing he wanted was to humiliate Karen further or inflame tensions. "I'm not going to replay the video," he continued, "because this isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about acknowledging that we have a problem. A cultural problem that didn't start with this incident, but has been brewing for years." A few heads nodded in the audience, and Marcus could see the impact of his words beginning to sink in. "Change isn't easy," he said. "It challenges us to confront the things we've ignored, the behaviors we've accepted, and the systems we've allowed to perpetuate. And yes, it's uncomfortable. But if we're serious about building something better, we have to be willing to face that discomfort head-on." He paused, letting his words hum in the air. Then, shifting his tone slightly, he added, "I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about what happened in that lounge. It's about what we stand for as a company. And as the owner of this airline, I take full responsibility for making sure that what we stand for aligns with our actions." There was a ripple of surprise at his statement. Though Marcus's ownership of the airline had been confirmed in the aftermath of the ticket incident, it still caught many off guard to hear him address it so directly. "I spent the last few days listening," he went on, "to your concerns, your frustrations, and your hopes for the future of this company. And what I've realized is that if we're going to move forward, we need to do it together. That means accountability at every level, including my own." The room was completely silent now, the weight of his words sinking in. Marcus turned his attention to Karen, who sat frozen in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "your actions in the lounge were unacceptable. But I also recognize that the culture we've allowed to persist made you feel justified in behaving that way. For that, I take responsibility. However, accountability is a two-way street. And while I believe in second chances, I also believe in the importance of earning them." Karen's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps understanding, or perhaps relief that Marcus wasn't going to make an example of her. Effective immediately, Marcus continued, "Karen will step down from her current position and transition to a role where she can focus on contributing to the company's growth in a meaningful and constructive way. This isn't about punishment. It's about creating space for everyone to align with the values we want to uphold." The announcement drew a few murmurs from the audience, but the general mood seemed to be one of approval. Marcus had managed to strike a balance between accountability and grace, and it was clear the staff appreciated it. Just as he was about to wrap up, Dana raised her hand slightly, catching his attention. Marcus nodded, allowing her to speak. "There's something else," she said, her voice steady but serious. "We've uncovered something during the review of the incident, something I think everyone should know." The room tensed again as Dana stepped forward, holding a stack of documents. She handed them to Marcus, who quickly scanned the first few pages. His face tightened, the calm confidence he'd exuded moments earlier giving way to something closer to shock. "These documents," Dana explained, "show a series of internal decisions made over the years, decisions that prioritize profits over people, including cutting corners on staff training and ignoring complaints about workplace behavior. It's a pattern that predates Marcus's ownership of the airline, but has continued under the radar." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps and whispers broke out as employees began to process what they were hearing. Marcus felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. This was the hidden rot he had suspected but hadn't been able to prove. A systemic problem that went far beyond individual incidents or bad actors. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. This wasn't the twist he had expected, but it was one he couldn't ignore. "Thank you, Dana," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "This is exactly why we need to have these conversations, not just to address individual behaviors, but to shine a light on the systems that enable them." Turning back to the audience, he said, "This revelation doesn't change our commitment to creating a better company. If anything, it strengthens it. We'll be launching a full investigation into these practices. I promise you this. We will hold everyone, including myself, accountable. Together, we will rebuild this airline from the ground up, not just as a business, but as a community." The room erupted into applause, a sign of both support and relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but at least now, they were all moving in the same direction. As the meeting concluded and the employees began to file out, Marcus caught Dana's eye and nodded. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they had a fighting chance. And as he turned to face the challenges ahead, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the airline still held, and whether he was ready to uncover them.